Hello everyone, I hope you're well. Welcome to this, the first podcast style thing I'm doing on this channel. As the domestic leagues come to a close ahead of the World Cup, I thought this would be a good time to assess the progress of FC Barcelona at this mid-season checkpoint. We've been doing a lot of in-depth analysis and I'm going to try to tie as much of that together in this summary discussion. This isn't going to be too heavy on the visuals. In fact, I might just recycle some old graphics. So stick it on while you're on a commute or doing the laundry or whatever. And I'll be bringing the usual purist perspective to what we've learned really so far this season watching this team. So diving in, we find Barca top of La Liga. 13 games played, 11 wins, 1 draw, 1 loss. Scoring 31 and conceding only 4. Which is not only the best defensive record in La Liga, but in all of Europe. Annoyingly, I am recording this just before Barca's final game against Osasuna, so this record is going to change, but hopefully not too significantly that it makes this redundant. But if we extend that domestic record out into a sort of combined league for the top 5, as they say, European leagues, England, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Barca would be third in that table after PSG and Napoli. Sure, you can argue about the relative quality of those leagues, and we are, after all, talking about a team that failed to reach the last 16 of the Champions League and has struggled in the really big games, particularly, Inter Milan, Bayern Munich, and Real Madrid. So while this team is good enough to win against most opponents, it's not quite good enough to beat the absolute best. And so let's start talking about the reasons for that, beginning with Barcelona's defence. So, like I said, statistically we're talking about the best defensive record in Europe, as long as they don't concede a bunch of goals to Osasuna, according to league form anyway. And that does go deeper than just goals conceded. Barca conceded on average, in terms of expected goals, just 0.62 xG per game, which again is the lowest in Europe. And so it's not just a case of, the defence being terrible and Ter Stegen stepping up. No, actually, Barca aren't conceding many chances. And that's a result, as we know really, of the high-risk, high-reward defensive system that we've talked about quite a lot on this channel. It's actually, numbers-wise, the highest defensive line in Europe on average, just a bit higher than Man City's, which is not that much of a surprise considering the similarities between the two teams. But that high line is also complemented by a very aggressive press, typically man-to-man. You've all seen it, we've discussed it before. But what might surprise you, or might not, is that Barca actually make the most presses out of any team in Europe. So to measure that, we use a stat called passes per defensive action, or PPDA. You might have seen it online, which essentially is saying how many passes does your opponent make before you do something about it. And so the lower the total, the more frequently you're engaging, essentially. And yeah, Barca have the lowest in Europe. So it's not, by the way, measuring the quality of the pressure. There's no direct correlation between passes per direct action and turnovers, but it is telling you about the team's defensive philosophy. And it tells us that Xavi, for 90 minutes without rest, does not want the opponent to have any time on the ball whatsoever. And that is different even from a team like Man City or Arsenal, for example, who might not always press the goalkeeper. It depends on the circumstances. I'm not going to get into which style is better, but certainly it tells us that 13 games in, Xavi is still the same idealist he was when he took over. His team is at the extreme of, defensive metrics and possession metrics, actually, in terms of, average possession and final third possession, very much at the top end of Europe. And that typically, those defensive numbers, the low goals conceded, the low XG, and the extremity of those figures compared to everyone else, is a result of the fact that Xavi wants to play the same way, the exact same way, against every single opponent, defensively. Offensively, we've seen variations, which we'll talk about later slightly. So, minor tweaks in shape or personnel depending on the opposition. But defensively, there's been absolutely none of that. So every game, same system, same pressing triggers, same intensity. And clearly it works against most opponents, based on the record. But it is predictable. And Bayern knew Bayern Munich knew that the press was coming, and not just that it was coming, but exactly how it was going to be implemented. And so they bypassed it by going direct on Barca's left-hand side, its potentially weakest point in that game. And Real Madrid actually created a specific shape to isolate Barca's weakest points. It was Busquets in that game against Modric. And so this predictability is, defensively speaking, is perhaps an area that Xavi might need to mature in, finding tweaks to the defensive setup to account for certain opponents. I'm not really suggesting that Barca drop deeper or they don't press aggressively. You know, keeping the ball in the opponent's third is the whole idea and the reason for those great numbers. So that shouldn't be abandoned. But against quality teams, there's definitely an argument that maybe you should tweak it a bit, you know, to protect a certain area of the pitch or to protect a certain player that you don't want to get isolated. Maybe it's changing your pressing trigger, allowing a specific opponent player to have the ball and press everyone else. You know, I think that's the next step for Barca. To be fair though, even in these big games, they have restricted the opposition to very few chances, and typically it's been quality that's been the difference. The relative quality between what has been essentially Barca's fourth and fifth choice defenders, as they've had to be because of injuries, and some of the highest quality forward players in the world. Against Madrid, you're talking about Vinicius and Benzema, and against Bayern, you're talking about the likes of Sané and Mane, etc. So clearly there's been a quality gap, but still there is the question mark over whether these slight tweaks can be made to account for that quality gap. Anyway, that's the defence. We'll see if any of those developments happen this season. I think certainly, you know, I've just talked slightly about injuries, but they have been significant, so getting players like Araujo back is going to make a big difference. But anyway, that's the defence. Let's move on to the fun part, which is Barcelona going forward in attack. So same as with the defensive stats, Barca's attacking output is right up there across Europe. Although they've only scored 31 goals, which is eclipsed by a few teams, Bayern, PSG, Napoli and City, I think they actually have a better XG than all of those teams on average at 2.44 XG per 90. And that shouldn't be taken for granted. This is, comparatively speaking, a very well-oiled attacking system. It's a positional system where the players understand the attacking zones they need to occupy. There's generally a lot of dynamism and movement to create space for one another. They rotate positions to create unpredictability. And when you have quality players, that's going to translate to a lot of chance creation. Obviously, some of those elements were missing. Thinking back to the first Inter game, for example, I talked about a lot of those elements not being at the level they had been. But generally speaking, since Xavi's taken over, this has been an attacking system that is well coached, and it's gradually improving too, especially in the first phase. I think Barca's build-up is probably its most accomplished phase right now. It's an area that has definitely improved since last season, and there's always been a big emphasis on finding the free man, and Ter Stegen particularly is very tuned into that. He has an important role in identifying where the free man is on the pitch and finding them quickly. And that's been the case from the beginning and has improved. But this season, you know, the likes of Balde, who stepped up and made Barca even harder to press. He's very good at accelerating away from pressure and can do so in tight spaces. And on top of that, you've got the technical quality of the midfield, which contributes to being very hard to press. Pedri, Gavi, Frenkie de Jong, Busquets most of the time. These are guys who have a very, very high technical level and very rarely concede possession. And so all of that together, you know, finding the free man, having good profiles now like Balde who can bypass pressure, and the technical quality of midfielders is why teams that try to be aggressive and press high have really been blown away. So Sevilla 3-0, Real Sociedad 4-1, Athletic Club 4-0. Barca have consistently been good enough to play through pretty much any press and exploit the space in behind. And I've done a lot of coverage on Dembele, obviously, and why he's so dangerous against the high line. And typically it is him who's had the biggest role doing the damage in those games. As frustrating as he is, and he is very frustrating, In most La Liga games, he's at a high enough level to decimate opponents when he's given space in the final third. But it's also worth noting, and this is a player that I perhaps haven't talked about as much as I should have, the importance of Lewandowski. And that goes for all the games, not just the ones against the High Lions. So first, his contribution to build-up, which really can't be understated. It's not just the fact that he can drop in and receive the ball when the midfielders are marked, although he does that, but his movement and the subtlety of it is so impressive. He might drift into a wide position, let's say on the shoulder of a fullback, and just by being there, he demands attention, and that might allow an unmarked forward or the fullback or the interior to run into that space. He creates numerical and spatial advantages all the time, and it's another way that Barca have significantly improved from last season, because although Aubameyang is a good goal scorer, he didn't really do any of what Lewandowski is doing in that sense. So, and on top of that as well, you've got the consistency of Lewandowski's goal scoring, because despite being involved in build-up, his priority is to be in the box at the end of an attack. And because his movement is so good, he's usually the best option when it arrives there, and it shows big time in the stats. He's only behind Haaland in the European Golden Boot race, and with 13 goals and 4 assists as of the recording of this video, he's been directly involved in 54% of Barca's league goals. And so that translates really to when he's had a bad game, when he hasn't been clinical, like in the first game against Bayern, it obviously really hurts the team. Which sort of brings me onto something in the attack that maybe isn't functioning quite well enough, and that's goals from elsewhere. Because after Lewandowski is Dembele with 4, and then Ansu Fati with 3, that's the league we're talking about, and Fati's only played the equivalent of 5 games. Generally, I would say that as long as the team is scoring goals, it's okay. It's not a huge deal where those goals come from. But I think something Xavi will want to see more of going forward is goal contributions from midfield. And that's goals and assists. Because between them, Gavi, Frenkie de Jong and Pedri, sort of primary creative midfielders you'd say, have got 4 goals and only 1 assist in the league. Part of this is Barca's emphasis on attacking from the flanks, something that I have covered, which does generally shift the burden of the final pass to the wingers or the fullbacks. But even so, you would expect these midfielders to be on the end of more attacks or being more decisive with their final passing. The good news is that obviously they're still young. Frenkie de Jong less so, but I think it's generally accepted that he'll have a more reserved role if he's going to be important to this team in the future. Pedri though, still 19, Gavi still 18, plenty of time to develop. But the absence of a really decisive player from midfield is an immediate problem. I think long term, if it were up to me, I would make Pedri that person. He has good attacking instincts, he's great between the lines, his movement into the box is good. He is certainly lacking right now, sometimes the final finish, or being, very decisive in the box. But I think that is something he can definitely add to his game. His ceiling, is extremely high. But he's not getting any consistency in that role in order to develop that week on week. And I think that's one of the ways that this attacking system could become even better. Because as good as it is, 31 goals in 13 games is obviously very good. I still think it has much higher levels to hit. I mean, we really have no idea what the best configuration of the front line is. There's no left winger that is really being consistent. When Pedri does play deeper, the right half space is pretty barren of creativity. Rafinha, a player who could probably fit that gap, is arguably being underutilized. So a lot is still up in the air. I do understand, I have to say, what Xavi is doing with all the tweaks. Like we said with the defensive setup, you've got to change things based on the opposition. You need different profiles in different places and so on. That's something that we've praised and is certainly the sign of a high-thinking manager. But there's a sense that looking at the bigger picture, is it at the cost of building important relationships? Building the all-important chemistry between attacking players. Because I think at the highest level, which is where Barca are struggling, That's the extra ingredient that you need to solve problems when the margins are really tight. Chemistry, understanding, finding unique solutions because you have good relationships with the players around you. If this were a more settled, more mature system using players in their prime, so Manchester City is the obvious example. Pep changes things every week and it's praised and it makes complete sense. And I think we'd be doing the same for Xavi about the flexibility that he's showing. But because of the stage that this project is in, with players still finding themselves, finding form, it feels just a little bit too inconsistent. And of course you have to factor in the schedule, games every 2 to 3 days or 3 to 4 days makes it really hard to get consistency. You don't want to run players into the ground, especially with the World Cup coming up. But one thing that I think we'd like to see going forward is more established attacking systems, more established attacking relationships at least. Left wing is the perfect example. It's pretty much an endless cycle, as Varane has a good game and then next time out he underperforms, and you can't just keep him on because Fatty's on the bench and you don't want to completely stunt his development. But then when Fatty underperforms, it's the same problem. You don't want to kill Varane's confidence. And so when neither is a standout player, the squad depth actually becomes a little bit detrimental. But anyway, the foundation is obviously there, and we can only assume that at some point things will become clearer, more settled, relationships will develop, and that might mean making some players unhappy in the short term, but I think you've just got to do it at a certain point. But to wrap up this whole thing, I'll talk a little bit about where I think this squad needs to improve, maybe some potential transfers in the short and long term. So let's do that. So generally speaking, this squad is in a pretty good place, but it definitely has levels to go up. The priority for me has to be to sign a right back. Last video, which was about Rafinha, I asked you guys which right back you'd prefer Barca to sign, and I've already started doing some prep for a video down the line where we discuss that in a bit more depth. I've been looking at the likes of Malo Gusto and Arnau Martinez, Vanderson, etc., because for me that is the major weak link in the squad. When all the defenders are fit and against top opposition, I'm still pretty comfortable with Koundé at right back, but with the injuries and so on, it's obviously not guaranteed. Balde's doing a good job, but I think you do want a right-footed player on that side in the long term. The Rafinha vid that I did sort of talked about the options that might open up. So that would be my preference. Big investment at right back and get someone who's top tier. Speaking of defenders though, with PK's retirement, there's the obvious question of whether Barca need to sign another centre-back. And personally, I'm actually not sure that they do. You'd essentially be spending money on a fifth choice. And yes, that's become relevant now, but it's a really anomalous situation where, you have to be regularly fielding your fifth choice centre-back. A lot of teams wouldn't even have that in the squad. If you spend money now and you spend it on somebody decent that's not just going to be a bench player, because, who's going to want to join and just be fifth choice centre-back that's any good? So if you are signing a slightly higher caliber player, then what does that mean for Christensen or Garcia? I think with where the squad is and assuming and praying that we don't get a similar catastrophe in terms of injuries, there is enough depth at centre-back. We've seen Marcos Alonso fill in there, which, yes, definitely isn't ideal, but Barca haven't actually lost in the league when he started at centre-back, and I'm not saying that he should be there or that it's a good option, but it's an emergency one, and it's going to leave you exposed against, real high quality. But in an absolute emergency, which shouldn't happen again, hoping, praying, that he can potentially do that job. My point really is that I'd rather see that money saved for someone who's going to increase the quality of the team. That could possibly be in the pivot position, the defensive midfield position, because it's certainly not consolidated. I think at this point, if Xavi really wanted to, and it's obviously the best economic option, is that you really work with Frenkie de Jong and make him the number one pivot. He's a smart footballer, and in the areas where there's still question marks, defensive awareness, ball winning, some aspects of his distribution, he can learn and improve. I'm quite confident about that. But with Busquets likely retiring this season, it's an area that needs reinforcement for sure, either in January or in the summer. If you're not going to go down the De Jong route, Maybe you get someone who's more ready-made for that position, somebody with a bit more natural defensive instincts. But I'm not going to dive too deep into that. I'll leave that debate for another day. Moving forward in the squad, we've talked before about the right side of midfield and whether a player like Bernardo Silva is necessary. For me, he would increase the level of the team pretty significantly. He's one of the best midfielders in the world, in my opinion, but it would be a very costly operation, I would assume. And actually, I think, the more I've thought about this, that right half space, that creative wasteland that it's been at times for Barca, could potentially be covered going forward by Pedri and Rafinha. I think if you give those guys bigger influence in the final third, a player like Bernardo becomes less necessary. I think Barca are fine in the first phase, like I talked about, the build-up's good. You've got a player like Frenkie de Jong who's press resistant and can deal with, carrying the ball into the final third, which is something that Bernardo would give you. But in terms of creativity and, the extra quality in the final third, I think it exists in the squad already. I think it just needs to be manoeuvred properly, which is why if there was to be a big injection of money, like would have to be spent on Bernardo Silva, I think I'd rather see it at left wing. And I know Ferran Torres was expensive and Ansu Fati is obviously the chosen one, but both are works in progress. And if Barca want to win right now, I think there's no clear elite option on that side. So someone like, and I've sort of hinted at this before, but someone like a Rafael Leao or, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Kvaratskhelia, someone who would take the attack most likely to another level in the short term. A signing like that, I think, would be really exciting, and alongside a high quality right back, the first 11 would be looking pretty scary. So if you imagine you'd have Ter Stegen, insert elite right back, Koundé, Araujo, Balde, Frenkie de Jong, Gavi, Pedri, your elite left winger, Lewandowski, and then Dembele or Rafinha. That is a pretty damn good team that can compete, I think, at the highest level. It's extremely young, though. It is very young, and this is probably a good place to end. A big core of that team would be in its early 20s or even teenagers. And that means that you're likely to see some bumps in the road, potentially in the short term. But in the medium to long term, the potential for that squad is through the roof. You've got a coach that's young and learning, you've got players that are young and learning, but the raw fundamentals from a coaching side in terms of the positional play, the tactical tweaks to deal with different opponents, etc., that's really good. But then the potential of the players, Gavi, Pedri, Araujo, Koundé, potentially Ansu Fati, who could step up and still become unbelievable, that is scary talent. So I think actually, most of the ingredients for the long-term project are there already. So with a little bit of investment, maybe one or two marquee signings, a bit of patience and some better luck, definitely, in terms of injuries, I really do think this team is going places. So to answer the question of how good are Barca right now, I'd say pretty good. I'd say one of the best in Europe, actually, and the numbers back that up. But the potential is what's even higher. And if you're a Barca fan, I've said it before, I think you're in for a really fun ride over the next few years. As long as they stick with it and there's patience, because it would be a real shame to have all of this potential and because, you lose a couple of games, it's thrown away and you start again and you have to start the project from zero. I think that's a terrible idea, and I would like to see this project with these players and this coach see it through to the end. And that's a good place to finish, I think. So if you stuck with me all the way to this end, thank you so very much. I did hope you enjoy this style of content. I won't be doing it regularly. I'm sort of just in the middle of things, preparing the World Cup and whatnot. So do let me know how you found this. Leave a like if you did enjoy it, and I'll be back soon to, talk about the World Cup. So all the best, and I'll see you then. Take care.